Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short history of the Second World War, this one dealing with the Soviet Union and the West. This is quite a long chapter, so I've split it into three separate videos, and we're now on to the second, which I've called Growing Tensions. Stalin had told the Yugoslav delegation in early 1945 that under the new order, whoever occupied a particular territory and had the necessary military power would impose his own social system upon it. Thus, by 1945, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and the Baltic states were all occupied by the Red Army and would soon adopt the Soviet system. The exception was Yugoslavia, where communist support rested on real local support rather than Soviet power, derived from the most successful anti-Axis resistance movement during the war. In this model, the Poles suffered the worst. They had been horrifically terrorized by the Germans and their Soviet allies at the beginning of the war, and the countries now occupied by the Red Army had fought the hardest against Germany and had the most reason to dislike the Soviets. The Soviets, for their part, held the leaders of the Home Army they had gathered and imprisoned them. Both American presidents of this period, Roosevelt and Truman, held that democracy, as they defined it, was essentially in Poland. At Yalta, all three great powers agreed that Poland's new eastern border would be the Curzon Line, which I referenced in the previous video, that Poland would receive substantial territory from Germany, and that there would be free and unfettered elections by secret ballot in a multi-party framework. On this basis, Roosevelt and Churchill promised to recognize the provisional Soviet-backed government in Warsaw. That's the one from the Lublin Committee. Ernest Bevin, the new British Foreign Secretary, even got a promise from the Polish Provisional Government leader in July 1945 that free elections would be held. But the Westerners were told that it would take time to organize an election, and it was not held until January 1947. During this period, the communists attempted to intimidate their opponents, and the anti-communist resistance killed government officials. When the elections came, votes were rarely secret and were generally counted by the Polish communists, who gave the official results, which were rather suspect, that their bloc had obtained 80% of the vote, and the London polls only 10%. Parker thinks it's likely that the London polls got around 70% and the communist bloc only 20%. The leader of the London polls fled in October 1947, having realized that he and they in general had no future under the new regime. Despite Churchill having earlier made an impassioned speech in support of Polish freedom and in praise of Polish heroism, neither the British nor the Americans offered the Poles practical support. They didn't want to have a war with the Soviet Union. Their verbal appeals had no impact. Note, in contrast to Poland, the Americans and British did not oppose the incorporation of the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union, despite them having been forcibly seized by the Soviet Union during the course of the war. Finland and briefly Czechoslovakia were exceptions to this new order. Although Finland was now in the Soviet sphere of influence, they were allowed to retain their domestic independence at the price of international subservience and ceding all the strategic positions desired by the Soviets, which have noted that the Finns had fought tenaciously and well against the Soviet invaders. The Czechs hoped for the same, but they were unsuccessful. For their part, in the countries occupied by the British and the Americans, that's Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, and Denmark, liberal democracy was soon reintroduced, the British rushing to occupy Denmark before the Red Army could do so. The British also forcibly defended the conservative Greeks against the Greek communists. They were effectively applying Stalin's principle of control wherever they had troops. But whatever they did in practice, they objected to the notion in theory. Stalin and Molotov chided the Western Allies that the Soviets were doing essentially the same thing as they were, and he wasn't complaining about their actions in Italy and Greece, those being within the sphere of the West. An ideological gulf was opening up between the two sides that was only briefly covered up by the ambiguity of their agreements at Yalta and Potsdam. For the Marxists, any free election that would reflect the will of the people would necessarily lead to a communist victory, because only such a victory would put an end to the class struggle that was inevitable, that was the inevitable result of the historical process. Only the communists really understood what would be good for the people, and they would organize the economy accordingly. By contrast, the British and the Americans believed that happiness would only be achieved through a system of unrestricted secret voting and a market economy based on individual choice, with some degree of state intervention to compensate for imperfections in the market and to help those who were unsuccessful or unlucky. During the war, Western opinion had been shaped in the belief that, like the West, the Soviets wanted to win a war for democracy and freedom against the Nazi idea that the state had the right to exact unquestioning obedience from its citizens. Suddenly, particularly in relationship to Poland, they had discovered that this was not the case. The Soviets also wanted the unquestioning obedience of their citizens. But what could the West do apart from accepting the new status quo? What Churchill described as an iron curtain now divided the two spheres of influence. That was the reality. But the Westerners were upset when Stalin appeared to want to extend this sphere. This was illustrated by two developments at war's end. First, during the war, the three powers had agreed that the Soviet Union would occupy northern Iran so as to protect the supply lines used for the bulk of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. But at war's end, the Soviets showed no sign to withdraw, but rather to use Iranian proxies to badger the Iranian government to grant oil concessions to the Soviet Union. Secondly, in the spring of 1945, Molotov had asked the Turks to cede the border areas of Kars and Ardahan to the Soviet Union. In response, the British and Americans decided that they could only oppose those moves until the Soviet Union relented, as it eventually did. They concluded that the Soviet Union was still aiming to spread communism by force wherever that was possible, and that Western firmness was the only possible response. A decision rapidly reached by their ministers and officials, and more slowly by sections of public opinion in the two countries, as they came to lose faith in Soviet good intentions. So thank you to you for listening to the video, and particular thanks to my patrons, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. Please, you're very welcome to support my channel if you so wish. Like, comment and share on the videos, it really does help. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll move on to the final section of this chapter about the Soviet Union and the West, this one dealing with Germany and East Asia. Have a good day.